Hello and welcome to the Lancaster Patriot Podcast. My name is Chris Hume, and today's podcast is brought to you by Legacy Roofing, the world's greatest roofing company located right here in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. If you need a new roof, call Legacy Roofing at 484-219-4005. Again, Legacy Roofing for all your roofing needs. I'm joined today by three men. First, Joel Saint, who is pastor of Independence Reformed Bible Church located in eastern Lancaster County. Joel, thanks for joining me.
Always good to be here.
So how long have you been pastoring at IRBC?
Yeah, over 10 years.
Over 10 years, okay.
Yep.
Second, I have Travis Schmalhofer, former sheriff's sergeant right here in Lancaster County as well, graduate of Covenant Theological Seminary. Travis, thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me.
And third, Mr. Paul Miller, pastor of Hopeland United Methodist Church, which is also located in Lancaster County. Paul, it's great to have you. Thanks for joining us.
This is my privilege. I'm glad to be here.
Yes, really excited to have you here because today we are talking about the United Methodist Church. Paul Miller is the resident expert in Lancaster County on the Methodist Church. So I want to set some context for our discussion today. So let me just set the stage here. A little bit of history on the Methodist Church. In April of 1968, the United Methodist Church denomination was created with the merger of the Evangelical United Brethren Church and the Methodist Church. So this was 1968. Joel, you were alive then.
I was in the land of the living.
The only one at this table.
1968.
The only one at this table that was alive, I would imagine.
Yeah, I was only 11, but it's funny. It's funny how that was. The hippie movement was. How are we getting the hippie movement already? But it was in full flower. I was 11 years old, and I didn't know much about the hippie movement, but I knew I hated them all. I was 11 years old. Couldn't stand any of them.
Did you have any recollection of the United Methodist Church forming?
I do not. I had a friend who became a Methodist, and I remember his saying consistently, it's not that there's a method to your madness. It's that there's a Methodist to your madness. So I remember him saying like all the time. Attended a Methodist church in Morgantown, PA, right on Route 23, which that building was built back in the day when people walked to church, so it didn't have any parking lot. So it later became a business.
Yeah,
or whatever.
So in 1968, you had this general conference in Dallas. And you had the representatives from each of those churches come together, and they recited the following words here in front of like 10,000 people. They all said it together. They said, Lord of the church, we are united in thee and in thy church, and now in the United Methodist Church. Amen. Okay, so over the next 50 years then, the United Methodist Church would grow to become one of the largest denominations in the nation. Right? I mean, I looked at some resources at some points over the past 10 years. I don't know where it is this day. You might know more, Paul, but the United Methodist Church was only behind the Roman Catholic Church and the Southern Baptist Convention. I guess that would be in terms of number of congregations. Is it still that, number 3?
As far as I know, although it's the last couple of years have made it a little interesting.
Okay. Yeah, well, that number is dwindling now, which we'll get into. So there's been trouble brewing in the United Methodist Church and in other denominations, to be sure. It's not just the UMC, but specifically around our culture's embrace, kind of full-on embrace of homosexuality. That's a big part of this. And I'm going to let you speak, Paul, eventually here in a minute and tell us if any of this you think is inaccurate. So at this point, thousands of congregations within the United Methodist Church denomination have left. In 2023 alone, we're at December, at the end of 2023, about 5,000 congregations received permission from their regional conferences to leave the denomination. So they might not have left yet, but they got permission, right? That's what that means?
Correct. 5,600 just this year.
In just 1 year alone.
Is that the U.S. only, or is that internationally?
Just the U.S. only,
okay.
Although there's some good stories I can tell you from overseas, too.
Okay.
Peter Smith, this is a story from the Associated Press. He said, quote, "The schism marks a historic shift in a denomination that was until recently the third largest in the U.S., so he might be saying it's not anymore, and perhaps the closest to the mainstream of American religious culture. Its steeples prominent in rural crossroads and urban squares, scenes of countless potluck suppers, earnest social outreach, and warm yet decorous worship." Speaking of social outreach, that's actually how I met you, Paul, going to an event you guys had. And you also go out kind of door to door as well. So I appreciate that about what you're doing there at the church. Smith goes on, he says, United Methodist rules forbid same-sex marriage rights and the ordination of self-avowed practicing homosexuals, but progressive Methodist churches and regional governing bodies in the U.S. have increasingly been defying these rules. I do want to ask you about that in a minute, Paul.
Sure.
So, and then the last thing here is the first denomination-wide legislative gathering in 8 years is scheduled for next year. And they're going to actually, that's where they will consider the calls to liberalize policies on marriage and ordination. So I got a video to play, but first let me ask you, so am I correct in understanding this, that current United Methodist rules do not allow same-sex marriage, as I call it? They are against homosexuality on paper.
Yes.
But many churches are rejecting that. And so basically, is it these churches that are getting out are saying the writing's on the wall in 2024, the United Methodist Church is going to accept this stuff?
It's probably a bit more complicated than that. And, I hate to use that term because that's what everybody says. It's always
well, that's why we brought you in, so explain it to us.
Decomplicate it.
Yeah. On paper and in our book of discipline, and our current book of discipline, which is the rules of polity for our church, the latest one was from 2016. Every 4 years, the denomination gets together to revise the rules, to come together. They vote on legislation, they vote on amendments, they vote pretty much anything, because that body that meets is the only group that can set the policy and what goes out. It's the only group that can speak for and on behalf of United Methodists in the entire denomination. Bishops can't. Pastors can't. They may be able to speak to their local context, but they're not able to speak.
Is it recommended, or is that the churches have to come in line?
They have to come in line with those.
Okay.
Now, there's some interpretive wiggle room in some areas, like for a church to set up some of its governing boards.
Okay.
But on terms of theology and doctrinal standards, yes, they are supposed to unite.
Okay.
Yeah. And back to that, but yes, I believe it's paragraph 304 in our book of discipline. It's written almost like a legal document. It says that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. Okay. And it's very clear on that. And therefore, practicing homosexuals are not to be ordained, and clergy are not permitted to perform marriages. Those are the two specifics in there.
And you said normally this is every 4 years, but did they not do one of these in 2020? So now you got an extra 4 years here.
Yeah,
that brings us to 8 years.
And there's a little bit of a caveat in there too. They are able to call special sessions, and there was one in 2019 that's worth mentioning there.
But as it stands
Correct.
right now, the position is the biblical position against homosexuality.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Well, let me play this clip. This is the only clip I have for today, and then I'm sure, Travis, you'll have some questions as we go here. I want to play this clip. This is from earlier this year, and this will help just our listeners kind of understand even more what's going on. And there's a Methodist pastor in this clip that is going to be talking as well, and so I want us to interact with that eventually. So here's a 2-minute clip talking about the United Methodist Church split.
Tonight, dozens of churches, United Methodist churches nationwide, are disaffiliating, divided on issues involving human sexuality, including same-sex marriage.
10 Tampa Bay Shannon Clough spoke to one local pastor in St. Petersburg who explains why his church is staying.
Allendale is a United Methodist church that is committed to doing the work of anti-racism and loving and affirming LGBTQ people, standing in solidarity with those who are being marginalized.
That's why Reverend Andy Oliver at Allendale United Methodist Church proudly performs same-sex marriages.
We proudly do so because it's the right thing to do.
In the past week, 55 Florida United Methodist churches disaffiliated. 6 of those are right here in the Tampa Bay area. The Florida Conference of the United Methodist Church states 55 churches disaffiliated, citing paragraph 2553 in the Book of Discipline. This outlines 2 issues, same-sex marriage and a pastor's sexuality.
I just want to make sure that trans and LGBTQ larger community knows that they are loved and affirmed by this pastor and by this church.
Those who disaffiliate will have to pay certain costs, including unpaid bills and insurance. If they fulfill their financial responsibility, they can leave and keep the property. The split in the church and new Florida laws have some parishioners afraid.
We've had a few families already leave the state because they did not feel safe here.
For that reason, Reverend Oliver says his church isn't going anywhere, standing strong in a denomination that's divided.
My job as a pastor and our job as a church is to stand in solidarity with those that are hurting.
In Pinellas County, Shannon Kuo, 10 Tampa Bay.
We did reach out to all Tampa Bay area United Methodist churches disaffiliating. Two of them replied to us, one of them saying no comment. The other, New Hope, sending us this statement saying in part, they've always been rooted in Orthodox Christian beliefs, going on to say the more UMC, quote, drifted away, the more obvious it became that they needed to choose a, quote, different path.
All right, so that was one of many news stories on the subject. Travis, anything initially, any comments or questions you have for Paul as we're going to unpack this a little bit more?
Yeah, nothing specifically questions for Paul, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, yeah, let's and you can bring your comments in later as well. Yeah. So Paul, I guess, and then any questions we have, I just want to open forum here to see what's going on here. Paul, why are, maybe speak to the church you're a pastor at and these other churches, why are they leaving in mass? Why not wait until 2024 and try to, I mean, I have my opinions, but why wouldn't they say, well, we're gonna try to maintain the orthodoxy, at least in terms of this, that apparently the United Methodist Church does have on the books? What's going on there that all these churches are like, we want out now?
Well, in order to give you the full statement, I would need to go back to the year 2016. And 2016 was our last general conference. And to be fair, there is one thing I needed to correct on that opening part where it said that we grew to the largest denomination, or the third largest. Actually, the merger pretty much made us the third denomination, and the United Methodist Church has not had a single positive year of growth in 6 decades. To give you an idea. So this is a very long time coming.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, that being said, it happened within 4 years of that 1968 year where they merged. Within 4 years, that's where the paragraph that says in our book of discipline that says homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, it was added in 1972 because there was a progressive push even then. And it was...
Those are hippies, right?
Yeah, that's right. The hippies taking over.
Through legislature, of all things.
Yeah. How about that? They hated that kind of stuff. But that is hippie influence. I mean, you think like that movie, Jesus Revolution or whatever? Mm-hmm. I mean, your church is already in trouble when a bunch of fornicating drug addicts are there to tell you how to do church, right? And so that's the way that kind of happened. And so this is not surprising that in 1972, the sexual mores that the Bible teaches started to loosen up. And it's amazing, though, a push back in 1972. Who would have thought?
Well, I mean, almost Machen would have.
Yeah, he would have. You're
right. This is the 100th year anniversary of Christianity and liberalism this year. And he pretty much wrote the standard. He was probably considered a prophetic kook whenever he first wrote something like this. In 22, whenever he wrote Liberalism or Christianity, which was the paper that was based on. And then the next year, he publishes a book that kind of becomes the blueprint for how this entire system comes about, how this entire unraveling of what really Christian orthodoxy becomes. But anyway, either way, that was even 50 years. So Presbyterians have really practiced at this, so I guess Methodists. Anyway, 1972, the push came, and so far the traditional line has held every single year. Part of that is because of the tactics that I would say that both camps have used. More progressive churches, those who have been pushing progressively, have tended to stay, and this is a tendency, there's always differences, but they tend to stay more localized, whereas the more traditional ones kind of fostered traditional Christianity through missions. So as 13 million members or 12 million members were in the United States in 1968, there may have been something like 20,000 in Africa. Don't quote me on that number, but get the idea. As it's gone to this point, now we are at the point where there are more members in Africa because United Methodism continued to explode.
And so it's been stagnant in the States for the most part?
Shrinking.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Stagnant would be generous in some areas, but...
So what happened then? So what happened in 2016 then?
The argument began to happen again. There was a election of a bishop. And that happens every 4 years where bishops are
put forward for election, and then they're consecrated. Well,
It's like the Pope of the UMC.
it's sort of, although that's one way to put it. It's more like the three branches of government. You have the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch. Well, the executive branch would be the bishops. The legislative would be our general conference, and the judicial branch, we have a judicial council that rules on and interprets some of that law.
Keep talking.
Sure. The struggle comes whenever the executive branch begins to not necessarily follow what the legislature intended. And the Western jurisdiction, which is basically California, the Pacific Coast, elected a bishop named Karen Oliveto. And she was a open and practicing homosexual woman.
Was that the first female bishop?
Not the first female bishop. The United Methodists have been electing. Well, let's take it back to John Wesley. He licensed women to preach, so that much is given. But the first bishop in the United Methodist Church wasn't ordained until, I want to say it was 82.
Okay.
Don't quote me on that, but it's been since the 1980s. So she wasn't the first bishop, but she was the first openly practicing homosexual bishop.
And what year was this again?
2016.
Okay.
So obviously, 2016, they're defying their own statements.
And it gets a bit complicated from that point on, because what happened was another jurisdiction took up the case and said, wait a second, you've elected her illegally according to our doctrine. Mm-hmm. And the Judicial Council ruled on it. And what kind of came out of it was this weird loophole.
Wait, are we talking about the UMC or Biden's election? Sorry. There's some
was too
parallels
easy.
there.
2016 was a very...
You're right, that was Trump's first. Okay,
that was
anyway,
Trump's
sorry.
election.
That was
No, it was
Trump's
something in the
election,
water
yeah.
at that
Yeah,
point. I don't
yeah.
think
So
anybody
something
can
going on with elections. Okay, so they're like, hey, so the more traditional side is like, this is illegitimate.
Yes.
So did they oust her?
What they said, the Judicial Council seemed to have pulled a little bit of a loophole and said, okay, yes, we recognize her election was illegal. And what we will then do is refer it to the judicial process of the Western jurisdiction. In other words, they said, you may have just elected her, or I said they put the enforcement of the Book of Discipline back onto the group that just elected her and said, you guys handle it.
I wonder how that was going to turn out.
Almost. I mean,
Yeah.
I've likened it to say something along the lines of, imagine if you were the judge and you were a judge who was suddenly accused of some sort of malfeasance. And next thing you know, you're put on as the judge in your own trial.
Yeah,
That's
right.
kind of it's kind of what happened. Well, of course, Western jurisdiction wasn't going to do anything about that.
Right.
And everybody kind of threw up their hands. Once you get the General Conference, however, that's whenever things begin to push and the two groups begin to find. And finally, the bishops and the General Conference said, kind of, you know what, everybody time out. We're going to set together a special council. Commission on the Way Forward was what it was called. And what's going to happen is we're going to come up with three
Sounds
different...
progressive.
Yeah, well, everybody kind of did have a seat at the table on this,
Yeah.
I'll say this, and you'll see why. They said, we're going to come up with a way forward. We're going to push forward for a bishop's plan, and we're going to let other people kind of put together their own plans. And what came out of that were three different options. One was the bishop's plan, which was called the One Church Plan.
This is the woman bishop's plan.
More like the Council of Bishops.
Okay.
Yeah, I got to be more specific with that.
Plurality of bishops. Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
The Council of Bishops had a preferred plan called the One Church Plan, which said, we will... I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version of it.
Yeah, please do, 'cause we're already...
in the weeds of
Yes.
it. We're going to regionalize our Book of Discipline. We're going to say that we're going to allow Africa to have greater autonomy over itself. We're going to allow different regions like the U.S.
States' rights type thing.
Almost identical. Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Okay.
Which, in some measure, those areas already do have some level of autonomy, just not full autonomy. And since the statement on homosexuality is not officially part of our doctrinal standards, and it's just part of our Book of Discipline, that way it would say that Africa could enforce that part as part of the discipline, but congregations in the United States might not have to because it's not part of the doctrinal standards. In other words, it was called the One Church Plan, and as most traditional churches said, it was like, this sounds a lot like a lot of different churches' plans. This is not a one church. This is united in name only at that point.
Okay, so that was the Council of Bishops idea.
The more traditional side came up with a very cleverly named plan. It was called the Traditional Plan.
Okay.
Yeah, Traditional Plan. And there was another one called the Connectional Ministries Plan, which was very complicated, very similar to the regionalization with a few caveats. It actually wanted to create 3 separate bodies, a very progressive, a very centrist, and a very traditional brand. It didn't get a lot of traction, so I'll spare you the details on it. But at the 2019, they said, we're going to get back together in 3 years after these groups have come together, and we're going to vote on which one of these plans that we want to move forward on.
Who votes?
Delegates from all across the globe, actually.
From all the congregations within the UMC?
Not necessarily all the congregations, all the regional bodies. So as we are divided up into the states, we also have smaller counties. We have different. It's very similar in the United States.
Would a small congregation have a vote in who their regional representative is? Okay.
Yes,
So
those are voted.
you use the term delegate. Is a delegate always a minister?
No, they actually are 50-50. They're both, half of the delegates are ministers and half of the delegates are laity.
Okay.
So they have kind of this equal representation between clergy and laity there.
Yeah, different from Southern Baptists then. Southern Baptist delegates are often pastors, as far as I know. Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah, how do they govern that? I mean, how do they make sure it's half and half? How do you do that?
Ahead of time, the elections have to be done well ahead of time.
Okay.
And they
for the delegates. Okay.
Correct.
Gotcha.
And by and large, most annual conferences are pretty used to following this. It's been around for a couple hundred years.
Okay.
They're used to doing it. So
Okay.
I don't think there's much
have it down.
argument.
Okay.
But even if there are some people that can't necessarily make it to those conferences, they do have registered delegate, like almost alternates.
Okay.
Yeah, they call it equalizing lay delegates or equalizing delegates in order to make sure that there is the proper balance between them.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, we don't need to get into too much on what could go wrong with elections. Nothing ever goes wrong. But so this vote was in 2019 then
Correct.
for these plans. So what happened?
The traditional plan won.
Oh, wow.
The traditional plan won by, I want to say it was 54 to 46, I want to say. I could be wrong on that.
And I know you just talked about it. What specifically did the traditional plan say regarding homosexuality?
The traditional plan effectively said, we're going to keep the language in the Book of Discipline the way it is, and we're going to create greater enforcement measures. So that way the kind of loopholes that allowed for the situation with Karen Oliveto would not necessarily happen again, or at least it couldn't happen in the same way, because there's always there's always some sort of loophole that people look for.
Was she out of the picture at this point?
No, she is still actively serving as the bishop of the Mountain Sky region, which is Colorado.
And that was what she was elected to initially, or was she the head bishop?
The bishops are elected to the council of bishops.
Okay, so there's not one.
Correct.
Okay, so
there is a president, but
elected from within that.
Yes.
So she was not removed.
No, she still actively serves.
So would you say then the traditional plan failed in its execution?
Yes. It's funny. I'm hesitating there only because there's so much irony in that statement. The traditional plan was kind of like the international outcry. There's this perception, I think, that goes on in the United States where United Methodists tend to be looked at as very progressive. Well, there's a very large traditional element, as you've seen at our church here at Hopeland, that is actually very traditional. And Africa is 99.9% traditional. Now, that might even be within a margin of error. I mean, it is overwhelmingly traditional. So a lot of the delegates that came from Africa, which are now a massive majority, really a majority of the votes, almost all voted traditional, which kind of said that, hey, the missional work that was done by traditional churches so far back actually bore fruit and is almost coming back to defend what it saw as Christian orthodoxy.
Specifically as it relates to sexuality.
Yes.
Okay. So, but it didn't work, is what I'm getting at.
Correct. What happened was immediately, and I mean in some cases the next day, I'm going to get these numbers partially wrong, but I'm not far off. At least about a third of the regional groups, which are called the annual conferences, of the 54, immediately said, we are not going to follow the ruling of General Conference. We are going to act as if the other plan won, which was kind of a shock, because it's like, now what do you do? Mm-hmm. The traditional plan could say, hey, listen, we have won this vote. We have the autonomy to do it. But the progressive side said, it doesn't matter, we're not going to leave anyway, and we're not going to follow it, and we will go in defiance. So what ended up happening in January of 2020, if I remember it pretty distinctly, suddenly there was a message that came out, hey, we've negotiated away, and the traditional church is actually going to separate from the United Methodist Church, which shocked a lot of us. Like, wait a second, the vote was traditional. How are suddenly...
Yeah, why wouldn't it go the other way?
It was specifically from that. There's no real mechanism to remove members or leaders, for that matter. I would say most of the Council of Bishops is progressive. So that's kind of the enforcement agent. Remember the executive branch there. And what happened was, if they're not going to leave, the traditional side basically said, okay, fine, then we're going to leave.
So, all right, this is going to get into some of the stuff later I had. I know I sent you guys some thoughts from the Church Polity of the Pilgrims, and I know we're not going to get into all of that, but some disagreements here. There might be disagreements, and that's fine. But I guess specifically with this situation, to me, it's like an example, and maybe we could say, well, the United Methodist Church didn't set this up right. You know, they baked this in. They baked in their own demise. But basically, why? That's a huge flaw to me, it would seem, in this denomination, and maybe it doesn't apply to all denominations, but where the progressive wing can direct the direction of the denomination with a minority. Mm-hmm. So what are your thoughts on that?
I was one of those that were very frustrated. I mean, I make no secret, I am a traditional clergy. I'm very traditionally minded. In 99.9% of statements, I'm sure that we would agree on what basic Christian orthodoxy and tenets work. And I'm sure there would be some more. Anyway, I had a problem at first, and it came to a very similar conclusion to what you said. It felt like the only reason to have a 2019 General Conference, the only point was that there was no point. What happens then if the entire reason that you have a group comes together, and if they make a decision and have absolutely no ability to enforce that decision anymore, then yeah, it seems like there is a problem that's like you said, baked into the system. So it took a little while to come to terms with it, but leaving did seem to be the only recourse that traditional clergy had and traditional congregations had to leave. And it was actually negotiated. There was a very famous lawyer, Ken Feinberg, who actually negotiated the 9/11 Victims Fund. He came through and did kind of pro bono work and brought traditional people, centrist, self-styled centrists, and progressive leaders together at the table and said, we're going to hammer this out. And what came out of that was a proposed legislation to the 2020 General Conference that was called the Protocol of Grace and Reconciliation Through Separation. So it's just called the Protocol for short. I'm not going to make you repeat all that thing. They called it the Protocol. And what it said was the traditional church would leave, and the remaining United Methodist Church would provide $25 million in seed money for the new denomination, as well as allow churches to align with the new traditional denomination should they felt in good conscience they had to leave. And everybody was in agreement with it. But
I know where this is going.
2020 is where COVID lands.
Right.
And the legislation that was proposed for this 2020 conference never happens because COVID lands and hits. And I mean, that took the whole world by storm. Now, regardless of, where anybody landed on COVID at that time, nobody knew what up was down. We had to make decisions within like 3 months of whether we were going to have an international gathering. Delegates from Africa were not going to be able to make it. They had shut down the airports. So everybody said, yeah, you know what, this makes sense. We need to shut things down. So it was postponed to 2021. 2021 rolls around. Okay, yes, there's the miracle of vaccine that's going to solve all the problems, which, how's that lasted is a good question enough. But it was largely only available in the States. African delegates were not able to necessarily get it yet. And it gets pushed off to 2022. And then in March of 2022, it feels like everything hit the fan all at the same time. There was a commission on General Conference that met that decided whether or not General Conference was going to move forward. And rather than postpone for just another year to 2023. They opted to postpone until 2024. And that caught everybody's attention for two reasons. One, it seemed as if, okay, this is getting kicked down the road further, which has kind of been the complaint for years. We've been kicking this down the road, kicking this down. We're not addressing it. There is another piece from the 2019 special session that I hadn't mentioned yet, and it was called paragraph 2553, which was brought up in the video that you shared.
I got to say, about this is making me ever more happier to be part of an independent church.
I didn't sign up to be a lawyer on these things.
You became one by default.
Oh my gosh, I'm telling you.
All right, so the last thing, bring that up, and then, unless I missed here, what then happened in 2022 with this lawyer guy's plan to be like, hey, let's have this peaceable. Let's give you guys, because I mean, on the surface, it's like, man, this is a great strategy, and this is one of my concerns with the nominations, big one, small, I don't know, that you get the progressive, they infiltrate, or however they get in there, and then they take over and they get all the resources. And now you have the traditional churches almost begging, well, we got to pay money to leave this denomination that was mostly traditional, and now the progressives took over. So how did that end to bring us up to where we're at now?
The paragraph 2553 was baked in 2019 at that special session of the General Conference, and what it was set to do in essence was, if there was a congregation that couldn't abide by the ruling, like let's say you had a progressive congregation that genuinely wanted to be progressive and they couldn't follow the standard, the traditional standard that was voted on, there was a way to say, you have a way to leave with your building and your assets. There is a trust clause in the United Methodist Church that says the denomination essentially owns the denomination, or I should say, the congregation holds in trust for the denomination, for the trustees of the conference, everything from the bell tower all the way down to the pencils in the pews. They own pretty much everything. And that's what a lot of the contention is. People have built memories around these sacred spaces, and they don't necessarily want to leave. So what they said was, okay, here's the deal. I'll spare you all the jazz on it, because there's quite a bit of story on it, but essentially pay the current year's worth of conference dues, plus an additional year's, plus past pension liabilities for retiree pastors, and anything that was in the back owed to the conference. And basically, you may then leave with your building and assets.
Oh, they have pensions. Joel, you're in. Maybe you should not be a part of an independent church.
Yeah, no, yeah. I'm warming up to the United Methodist Church.
Can you clarify? And this is probably me, but some people might have a hard time following too.
Sure.
At first, I thought you said that this guy came in, this lawyer guy, and said, "Here's a plan for the traditional churches to leave." But isn't what you just said that this other plan was for the progressive churches to leave?
Originally, that was the plan.
For what?
It was expected that progressive churches would leave.
Okay.
And then in January of 2020, whenever the negotiation happened, whenever the traditionalists realized, okay, the progressives really aren't leaving, we're going to leave instead,
Gotcha.
Everything kind of switched. So the agreement of 2019 then became the out for the traditional churches. Now, things got a little screwy almost immediately after that, because there's a provision in there that I will say, and I'll say very frankly, I don't think it was very well thought through. There's a sub-paragraph 4 that says conferences may add additional terms and stipulations. And that's where things got into the weeds.
Yeah.
Kind of, yeah. Like, there's different circumstances. I get it.
The
California
door is open.
And that's the way it was viewed.
Yeah.
There were some conferences that then said, okay, well, we can shut the process down a year ahead of time. And not because that 2553 had a sunset of 2023. 2553, the paragraph that allowed churches to leave, had a sunset clause at what date are we at now? The 21st or something?
December 21st.
Yeah, that expires in 10 days.
To make a request.
To not only make a request, to actually have everything finalized. Okay. So the denomination has finished with all of its work. It's, as far as it's concerned, 2553 is pretty much a done deal at this point. It's no longer part of the discipline because it sunsetted out. But that postponement from 2022 to 2024 seemed like a lot of bad will with the traditional churches suddenly leaving, because it seemed like you're trying to lock the door that is open on churches now. You're not allowing for a vote on something that was agreed upon to allow churches to leave. That was really a hard pill to swallow, along with the fact that the signers, the original signers of that protocol agreement, the centrist and progressives, I don't believe it was all of them, but most of them, all withdrew their signatures from the proposed agreement after 2 years of support for it. And the reasons given were times are different now, things have changed, their circumstances are not the same as they were in 2020, kind of like loosey-goosey kind of answers that didn't quite nail down. You sign a mortgage for 15, 30 years, circumstances change. You still have to sign that mortgage agreement. Now, part of it is that there was no vote of law. The General Conference didn't meet, so it couldn't become law. So, anyway.
Okay.
I hope that kind of brings some clarity, and I can bring more as questions come up. But yeah.
Any questions you two have before I have more questions to break this down so I can understand it more? Anything you guys got?
Always think of Joe Stalin, right?
You always do?
I do. When it comes to elections and voting.
Most guys think of the Roman Empire, as I've heard. But
yeah. Joe Stalin, Uncle Joe, who understood elections. It's not who votes, it's who counts. And really what he's saying is who is in charge to make decisions even after the votes are counted. We have a case here where the votes were counted and it meant nothing. Totally, in the end, it meant nothing. Joe Stalin would understand.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things in my mind going through right now as I was listening to that history there, which is interesting because it's very different than my denomination. I'm in the PCA, Presbyterian Church America.
A lot of good friends in that denomination.
Yeah. And, we have obviously more of a denominational organization than Chris and Joel have, but definitely not as complicated as that.
Well, coming out of the Presbyterian world, I could totally see that. I mean, one of the things that was supposed to come out was no trust clause, which I know the PCA was one of the things that adopted. The early 20th century, the Presbyterian Church had all those arguments about rules of law and things. So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
But yeah, it is similar to you already brought up Machen, J. Gresham Machen, and his battle back in the early 1900s. It seems like that just continues to play out in all of these different, we had this same thing with the Anglicans a while back, where a lot of, when I was in seminary, one of my profs, he actually left and joined the African Anglicans. And he was from here. He wasn't African at all, but it was because they were actually conservative. They actually believed the Bible. And so he got out of, association with the Anglicans here because of that very reason. So it's very interesting how similar all that is. And just, I guess what I was thinking of when you were describing how the progressives just basically said, we're not going to listen to this ruling or this decision that was made. It's both sides are practicing, if you want to call it civil disobedience, but disobedience in a sense.
Yeah. Wait a minute. Does the conservative side ever practice civil disobedience? If the conservatives would have lost, they would have said, okay, we lost, we're going to go by it. But the progressives don't do that stuff.
I agree with you. But I think we saw it in 2020 and after with political conservatives pushing back against a lot of the things that are going on, some more than others. I guess the point is like they both have a standard that they're looking at. The progressives, the standard is progress, change.
Well, I think you heard it in
myself.
The video we heard from Allendale Church. The first thing we heard, and I mean, not to speak negatively against a colleague, but I'll speak negatively against a colleague here. What are we here to fight against? We're here to proclaim anti-racism. We're here to proclaim. I'm like, you're a church. You should be proclaiming the risen Lord.
Yeah, I wrote down what he said: anti-racism, and that they were there to love and affirm LGBTQ plus, perform same-sex marriages, all that kind of stuff. So they're disobeying because of their standard, and we only disobey when our standard, so then we have okay, the traditionalists are looking and saying, well, we're definitely not going to go along with all this the way things are, so I guess we just have to leave. And that seems like that's what always happens. The conservatives end up just having to leave.
Well, that's Joshua, what is it? Joshua Wellman's part of his argument, I think, against, he's arguing for independent churches. And he's saying what always happens is the big denomination cannot maintain purity. He says it is obvious teaching of ecclesiastical history that centralization in church government is far less strenuous in its opposition to the insidious advances of sin and error than it is in its opposition to true reform. Now, you and I might disagree, but I do agree with your point there, and I think that's his point. And maybe some people would say, well, no, there's been denominations where they've curtailed it and they've kicked out all the progressive churches.
Yeah, but not permanently. It seems to be a temporary thing when they do that. I mean, name me, to your point,
well,
Chris.
I don't know where that even happened. It might have, but I don't know.
Well, I mean, I remember the Southern Baptists, and they kind of went south a little bit, and then they had the big boys come in.
Yeah, but they're technically independent churches anyway.
Yeah. I mean, the polity is different, but I want to ask this question then in relation to your point, Chris. And I know this kind of philosophical question, but name me a denomination anywhere that didn't eventually go south. Name me the 300-year-old denomination that's still biblical.
Well, I guess I would throw the same thing back at you and asked about an independent congregation.
Okay, the big difference there is a lot easier to leave, a lot less hassle, a lot more local autonomy. What are you going to do when your leaders in the big denomination go south?
I think it's the same.
Because I don't think it is, because it's not the same. Because in a local, I'm pastor of an independent church. Someone comes up to me and says, "Hey, Joel, you're off the Bible here. Okay, let's definitely talk about it." In a big denomination, guess what? Let's turn it over to the session, and the local pastor is right off the hook.
It depends if your session is actually.
Right, and what control does the local member have over the session? Almost nothing.
Well, I mean, I guess we could argue practicalities all day long.
I get it that I'm arguing against your church. I get it, but it seems to me that the facts are we just don't have a denomination that stayed true over. I mean, I have a friend who became Roman Catholic, and I told him, I said, I love the idea of. I like the idea of the Pope in this sense. If the Pope speaks to the civil authority, say the church is against this. The church is going to stand up against this. It sounds pretty cool to have one guy speaking for everybody and everybody gets it.
Right.
I said, but I know the doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church. I know what you guys are against. You guys are against abortion. You say this. Okay, I'm going to go down to Georgetown University, or I'm going to go to Fordham, or I'm going to go to Notre Dame, and they're going to be sounding exactly like the local state universities. So where are we now? Where is our centralization to this point? How's it helping? And I don't see it helping anywhere. I just don't. I don't see it helping in history, and I don't see it helping now. PCA, right? They got the revoice thing going on. I mean, does anybody? Let me ask you, Travis. Well, I feel like I'm beating you up here today, but let me ask you.
He's scared to beat up on the Methodists. That's the thing.
Yeah.
No, punching down.
Plus, he's used to doing it. So,
The Methodists, that's just piling on. The PCA guy. Is there any doubt in your mind? I'm sure your response to this. I'm not answer as such, but I want your response to this. With revoice and what's going on now in the PCA, is there any doubt in your mind the PCA might be worth leaving in about 20 years?
I mean, it definitely comes into my mind because I know that it's a possibility, depending on how things go. I know there's still a lot of good, solid churches, good, solid preachers, elders, everything in the PCA. And at the last General Assembly, they definitely kind of outranked the progressive wing, and some of the more progressive
what's
pastors
your guarantee
ended up leaving.
that what's happened to PCA, what happened to the United Methodists isn't going to happen with the PCA?
Well, I guess you can't ever say that.
Yeah.
There is no guarantee, but there's no guarantee that your church is going to be faithful 10 years from now either.
But there is a guarantee that it's a lot easier to get out of Dodge when things go south. That's the difference.
I can speak to the Global Methodist Church, which is kind of the traditional outcropping that's come out of this.
I want to come to that in a minute. So hold that thought, because I want to tie this back into specifically the UMC and then you specifically, because and I want you to quickly tie together then where you're at, because you are considering, if I understand correctly, leaving the UMC.
Yes, Hopeland has been a part of a group of about 50 churches, I think it's exactly 50 right now, that has actually leveled litigation against the conference, our local Eastern Pennsylvania conference, to leave the denomination. Our conference handled things differently, just like almost every other conference did whenever 2553 began to become enacted. For about 2 years after 2019, nobody did anything. Part of that was because of COVID. It was expected that the protocol was going to pass, so people held off in good faith, saying, you know what, there's probably a better deal. In fact, we know what this better deal looks like. It should be enacted at the next legislative mission. So people waited. The first 2 years, there were only about 200 churches that left, just to give you an idea. And then the year after, whenever it became clear that things were moving on, it was 2,000. And then the year after, which is this year, 5,600. So, okay. I mean, it ramped up once the writing on the wall really became clear. So go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, so no, I want to come back to that, and I want to tie this together as it relates to this denominational thing, because I'm not saying, Travis, that an independent church can't fall into apostasy or teach false things. I think one of my questions specifically, and I know we're not going to finish it all today and be able to address this, but I have one more quote I want to read here from, this was a sermon from the 1850s where he's arguing against big denominations. He says, he's either quoting someone or saying this himself, "It is notorious that when false doctrine has inundated the church, it has flowed in from the clergy and not from the people. And when the people have been trusted with power commensurate to their spirit, with their spiritual culture, they have stimulated their pastors to a maintenance of the simple truth." Now, denominationally, I mean, even at least with the UMC, that's exactly what happened. You said the Council of Bishops are the ones that are progressive. Like, they're mostly progressive, right? What you said.
That's fair. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's been a leadership, not just just normal clergy, but at the highest level, if you will, that has been pushing it. So that's at least anecdotally consistent with what Joshua Wellman was saying in the 1850s. And so I think part of maybe his concern back then, and maybe mine today, is with this denominations, if the general trend seems to be that the progressive wing eventually causes a split, takes over and then causes a split. That's why you have, this split, and the PCA came from this. It's kind of like, Luke's argument with the civil government. Like, if you create this apparatus, the Marxists are going to try to take it over. And maybe this is a stretch, but if you create these big denominations, that's appealing to the progressives, because that's something they can go after. Whereas if you have an independent network of churches, there's nothing to go after. I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to try to go independently take over a bunch of churches, but there's influence, there's money with the United Methodist Church. And I think that's part of my concern, that you're setting up I don't think it's the biblical framework. We could have that whole debate, but I think that's part of, and that's fine, but I think that's part of what we see happening in denominations, why there's more of a push from the progressives, because there's something to gain here. And if I'm listening to your story, I'm like, man, if I'm a traditional church, I'm like, this stinks. Like, we have the majority, and now we're begging for the crumbs from this huge denomination that the traditionalists might say, we built this thing, with the Lord's help, we built this, and now we're begging the progressives to give us our property and money, right? So that's kind of where I'm coming from with the one of my critiques with big denominations. So I'll let you respond to that first, Paul. Anybody else wants to jump in? Where you stand now, so you're kind of waiting to hear back from the denomination.
Yeah, because of the litigation going forward, I think I can't go into too many details because, first of all, I don't know every single detail. There is a group of churches. It's not each church is pushing against the conference right now individually, but we are doing it as a group together using all the same. Is this
litigation church court litigation, or this is civil?
This is actually using the secular courts.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, which is a very important distinction here.
Because you're saying that they did not follow the church denomination did not follow their own statements to allow you to get out of the denomination?
There's several layers to it, but it's more trust. The question was right off the go. Wait a second. What you've put forward and what our Book of Discipline in 2553 says is these fees. Well, now there's X number of additional dollars as well.
Okay.
So
is that fair? Is it no? Well, a church like Hopeland, it's doing well. Could it do it? Yes, but it would still have to trust the denomination. It would still have to trust the conference to not amend the agreement further.
Yeah,
and asking for that trust whenever trust has been broken is one step too far.
So in simple terms, they said, here's what you need to do to get out, and now they're adding stuff.
Yeah, the 2553 had a base set minimum requirements. Now, some churches and there were some conferences that actually made it, interesting enough, easier because they were able to pull so much from other churches. In Texas, for example, they were actually able to pay down the fees of every single church that wanted to leave. So they were able to make it almost nothing for some of these churches. In fact, in some cases, I believe it was nothing for some churches to just be able to separate and leave. But in others, like for example, in Maryland and California Pacific Conference, it was 50% of the property value on top of it, which was completely defeated the purpose of what 2553 was intended to do, was to leave. Well, and the answer has been, well, if we didn't do this, we'd have to charge you for all of your assets then. It's like, no, wait a second, no, that's never how that's ever worked in our denomination. Yes, on paper, that's how it's worked, but every church that has wanted to leave, they might not have been able to leave right away, but if there was a will, there was a way. This is not the first time churches have left. Even before 2553, there were ways for churches to get out. They were unofficial ways, like closing the church and having a predetermined agreement of sale was one way. We call that paragraph 2549. It's the church closure clause. There was another one that was ruled out of order by the Judicial Council, 2548.2. That was ruled out of order after it had been in our Book of Discipline for 70 years. Suddenly it becomes out of order. A little bit of a question mark as to how that could have happened. I've actually heard from both traditionalists and progressives that both said, yeah, actually that probably should have been ruled out of order. So there's a bit of a split there.
All right. So yeah, I'm going to try to steer us away from the legalese for the rest of the time.
Thank you.
Because there's a lot there. I mean, I think it is unfortunate that this has ended up in civil court, and maybe I understand where your thinking on that is, but I guess to me that would be another, negative falling out of this whole thing, that now this is getting dragged in front of the pagans, as it were. Mm-hmm. But okay, so let's take it. Let's put this into practice. Some of the stuff we're discussing with the UMC and the denomination. Let's say you leave UMC, and this kind of goes to our theories of denominations. Like if you go to, so one of the options is to go with the Global Methodist Church, right?
Correct.
Which is began operations in May of 2022, and this is from their website. In its brief life, it has welcomed more than 1,200 persons as clergy members and officially welcomed 1,100 local churches that applied to align with it. Angola, Bulgaria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, England, Panama, on and on. So this is already it's a growing denomination. It's
actually larger than that now. That they need to have somebody update their website a little bit more often. But I did contact a friend of mine whenever I wrote that, who's somebody who's kind of in the upper echelons there and kind of knows things. He told me that there were over 4,000 churches now.
Okay.
So it has actually grown very substantially as churches have begun to exit and then reaffiliate. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, you're fine. So my question to you is, and obviously you don't have to say this is what we're going to do. I'm just curious your thought process on it. What would be, if you're going into and saying, okay, here's another denomination that could grow to be very large, and the same thing could happen. What's the draw to be part of that denomination, as opposed to saying, well, why don't we just, if we get out of this thing, why don't we just be independent?
There is something about having a national voice that is interesting for churches. We live in a very national world, very international world, really, because the first churches that joined the Global Methodist Church were from the Bulgaria-Slovakia conferences. That's a great story, by the way, but I'll spare you the details for now. The fact that a small local church could have a national, international voice is harder to kind of hear. And whenever we live in a very national world, I mean, I'm sure none of us here, I'm going to guess, spend most of the time, even at the Lancaster Patriot, which I know is local, I'm pretty sure we all check the national news on a fairly regular basis. So having that larger group gives you a larger megaphone. So there is a benefit to the larger culture as long as the message can stay consistent. To your point, as long as the message can stay consistent. The way you help combat that would be to say, let's make this as voluntary as a group as possible, which I know the PCA has done, and I think the Global Methodist has probably done to an even probably more loose extent.
Well, we're pretty close to congregational association. We're almost there.
Yeah, we're working at it.
If we, anyway, can continue on because once you take away all the structure and the apparatus and that you can be grasped, then I'm more open to consider like, hey, this is an association. Otherwise the progressives would have nothing to. There'd be nothing for them to fight to maintain. If UMC was more of just an association, I guess you could say, well, no, they're going to fight for the name recognition, but I don't know. I just don't see that. Anyway, that's just my perspective.
Well, to give you another example, let's say you wanted to do a larger mission in, say, Africa, where a lot of the Global Methodists will likely come from. If you were going to, say, build a seminary over there, you're going to need more dollars likely than one congregation can pull together. And that is a good way to make sure that your polity, your actual message, which has grown in Africa and really resonated there, continues to grow. Having multiple churches pulling their resources together in order to say, hey, listen, this is the gospel that we are presenting. This is what we teach. This is what we do. And then hopefully being able to build up the body of Christ internationally through missions, which I know is a big group. The autonomy is going to be much larger in, say, something like the Global Methodist Church, but along with that is kind of the other side of it as well. The fees are lower because the large superstructure is no longer there. And to top it off, the real kind of dig at this is to say it is very voluntary because there's no longer any trust clause in the Global Methodist Church. Part of the big deal is just to say this church belongs to the denomination is a really hard pill for most people to swallow nowadays. So in one sense, I will say that it seems as if most denominations that do have the split do learn from the independent congregations to say, you know what, there's something to be said about a congregation owning its own building, owning its own resources. So that way there can't be some overarching takeover. They can reaffiliate, they can go independent, and it goes in the other direction as well. If there is a church now that is really not part of the polity, we could say, hey, listen, we wish you well, we pray for you. You can take your building, but you're not part of our denomination anymore.
And you said that they couldn't do that.
They could not realistically. They could, but the only thing they could do is close the building, kick everybody out, and sell the property afterwards.
Okay. Well, to me, that's moving in a better direction. To me, what you're saying with the Global Methodist is moving in a better direction in my mind. So I would be happy with moving away from that huge denominational structure. And to your point, I think if you learn some things from that as a denomination, you say, well, we're not going to have this huge structure. I think it's going to be better. But that's just me. Anything you guys want to add?
Yeah,
about that?
I think a lot of the conservative denominations that have started in the last 50 years or so have learned that lesson. And it wasn't as much of a problem of denominational splits, since the Reformation until the late early 1900s when this all really began. And by that time, I think there was so much of a structure built, there was so much overhead that, so like the PCA, for example, and some of these other ones that have started, they're probably closer to the association type of idea than what the United Methodist Church is and what the PCUSA used to be and all that. So you're not going to hear any complaints from me about trying to keep the overhead low and trying to
trim the fat.
Keep the ownership of property and all these other things away from that centralized kind of power structure, I guess, if you want to call it that. Yeah. So I definitely agree with that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this guy right in the 1850s, he saw it then. He said it's once doctrinal error has obtained a lodgment in a consolidated church, and history shows that it can happen there as much as anywhere else. One of two things more usually happens: either the church is rent in twain, or the whole body lapses into the error. And in either result, the system of church government proves worse than nothing as a protection against heresy. Anyway, we could quibble with his application, but in this case, we had the UMC denomination is rent in twain. It's torn asunder, and we could say it had to happen. Okay, well, let's for our last maybe 15, 20 minutes here, I would like you first, Paul, and then get Travis and Joel involved in this. Well, first, let me ask you, if you give me like 30 to 60 seconds, maybe you don't want to share this, but like, are you leaning towards the Global Methodist Church denomination?
I'll say it this way. One of the things that Hopeland in particular has been a very independent church from the get-go. They were part of the Evangelical United Brethren. And even back in 1968, when that merger happened, they were saying, hey, listen, we're not quite sure why this is happening. This merger is happening. It was Machen has a part in his book wherever he says, hey, there might be major doctrinal issues and there might be small doctrinal issues. If you can get over the major ones, that doesn't mean you don't have to deal with the smaller doctrinal issues. We might disagree on what baptism looks like, although I don't know how everybody is at the table here. But the fact is that if we might be able to get along and say something like ministry together, we're both going to proclaim a very similar, almost word for word gospel on those issues. However, if we were to say try to merge churches, to ignore it suddenly and say that it's not an issue is a problem. So the EUB churches were especially in this Lancaster area, were really not certain about what this merger looked like. Every EUB church, former EUB church that I've been a part of, has said, we weren't crazy about it. Our grandparents weren't crazy about it to begin with. We're not even quite sure how it happened. So there's that kind of like frustration there. So some might feel like maybe we're doing our grandpappies happy, say, like a justice here. We're kind of doing that. Others, it's the trust issue. I've led from a place that has said, let's let Hopeland and the congregation, the members, the people that have been praying for the building for decades. I've only come in as minister. I might be praying for them for the last 5 years, but they have decades of prayer over this building and this congregation. Let's let them lead. I'm kind of saying, hey, listen, I can explain and I can show you where the chips lay. But the fact of the matter is, if you are dead set on leaving, I want you to know as much as I can possibly provide from you within reason. I mean, there's some things I can't become an expert on every issue and denomination and topic you guys want to explore, but I can help you get through that point. There's two decisions that need to get made, though. Hopeland has not made that decision officially yet, where it plans on landing. Okay. And I have also not played my hand where I plan on landing. This is part of there's a dual level of association.
You can tell us. Your secret's safe.
National broadcast. Yeah, why not?
National, wow.
I like to think it's see, aim high. That's the denominational.
We do have listeners in Alaska. Shout out to our Alaskan listeners.
Nice. I think it's important for ministers to let their congregations declare where their calling and where their mission truly is. It's too often that you have a rogue charismatic preacher come in who suddenly realigns the entire mission with them. And once that preacher leaves, they realize that really it wasn't our vision at all. It was that pastor's from the get-go. Yeah. That was part of why John Wesley put the trust clause in the founding documents of the United Methodist Church. It was just in case there was some rogue preacher that decided to come in and just take over and suddenly leave with the church. We've all seen instances of that happening.
Take the property and
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So fair enough. You don't have an answer on that one yet. That's fine. I understand. So we'll see here, hopefully, in the next several months.
Yeah.
Where you're gonna. I mean, you could leave and then later join another denomination. But anyway, those are the things you're wrestling with, right? You could join the Global Methodist Church. Mm-hmm. You could go independent and then stay independent, maybe have an association. You could theoretically join another denomination, I guess. So, yeah, my vote is for you. No, I won't give you my vote.
Let's all take the vote right now.
Anyway, no, I appreciate
set up an elder board. And
I appreciate you.
Who's counting your vote?
Yeah, I'm not that church. So I appreciate you trying to say, hey, where do the people want to go, especially with something like that. All right, last 10, 15 minutes here. I want us to interact with Andy Oliver's comments and give even you a chance. Paul, you've already spoken to it briefly, saying that we are to be about proclaiming the risen Lord, not anti-racism. Joel, what were your thoughts on that? He says that he's standing in solidarity with those who are being marginalized. And that's kind of I would say as an outsider, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that's the progressive wing in UMC. Like it's liberation theology. I have some quotes here from,
sure,
but I don't want to read them yet. But what were your thoughts on Andy Oliver there?
Yeah. So here's this lie. We're standing with the marginalized. You gonna stand with me, bro? My Bible is not allowed in your local government school. I am seriously marginalized. You standing with me, bro? No, we're not. No, it's such a fat lie that these people tell. And it's just flat out disgusting. I'm not a racist, but if I was, where are racists allowed in our modern culture? You standing with a racist? Well, no. And I'm animated a little bit because it's such an obvious lie, and these people never get called on it.
Right. I was reading his bio, and this was a new word I had never seen before. Folks, Folx.
Mm-hmm. Oh, is that?
Had you heard of that before?
Yeah.
Okay, I hadn't heard
I've
of
heard
it.
of them
non-sexist
ending things
language
with
now?
like X's and stuff.
Well,
yeah.
why are we
New
doing
one
that?
for me. I figured it out quick, but I've never seen that before.
Yeah, it says Reverend Andy Oliver, and of course this has he, him, his, is the pastor of Allendale UMC. And if you don't want to say that about UMC, that's fine. Three of us will we'll take care of this. If you want to wait till you're officially out. A church that is committed to anti-racism and radical solidarity with folks on the margins. He is grounded in liberation theology and following Jesus, a community organizer who always located himself with the oppressed, helping them to use their power to dismantle evil.
See, when did marginalized become a moral category? When did that happen?
It's tough to, I don't even know if I have an answer for that. I can say probably where it comes from in the United Methodist Church. So we talk about this history that they have of social justice movements. I'd actually say it comes from a very noble place to start. For example, John Wesley was a guy who would go out into the fields and preach. He would go out to the people that wouldn't necessarily be working and then manage to get to a church. I mean, all throughout the Middle Ages and the medieval, which is something I teach in school, it was very often that people wouldn't only have communion maybe once in their life. Maybe once a year if they were really part of the lucky groups here. And what he wanted to do was to bring it out to the people that would not necessarily get it. Now, that would be considered a margin. I think we would all get behind that level of...
Yeah, but see, here's the thing. It's
Exactly,
it's
that's not what he means, yeah.
self-fulfilling prophecy here.
Yeah.
We're trying to make the marginalized not more marginalized anymore. So now we can't minister to them anymore? It's a conundrum that you can't get out of it. Oh, I'm trying to bring the marginalized into the mainstream. Oh, good. I'm looking for new marginalized now? What are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I can't make sense out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm with you on that.
This Gustavo Gutierrez, and this is going back a while, liberation theology, but that's what Andy Oliver mentioned in it's on the church bio. And I thought it was interesting. I just want to read this. This is from a just standard website. Liberation theology is a religious movement that arose in the late 20th century, Roman Catholicism, and centered in Latin America. It sought to apply religious faith by aiding the poor and oppressed through involvement in political and civic affairs. It stressed both heightened awareness of the sinful socioeconomic structures that cause social inequities and active participation in changing those structures. Now, this guy, Gustavo Gutierrez, he was this Peruvian priest who was big into this movement or spearheading it, and he wanted to eradicate private ownership of the means of production, Joel.
There you go.
Marxist right there. So my question to throw around briefly is it possible to maintain Orthodox Christianity without applying it to the civil sphere? I was just thinking about this as I came across Andy Oliver and his reference to liberation theology. You have in the case of the United Methodist Church, Marxists are pushing their agenda, right? You wouldn't disagree?
I would agree with that. Okay. Yeah, I would agree with that.
So Marxists are in there pushing, at least whether they're self-avowed Marxists, they're pushing that liberation theology, which is practically Marxism. Get rid of private ownership. That's going to establish justice and freedom and equality, and they're pushing that. And how can you oppose that without applying the Bible to the civil sphere? So that's like if you say the Bible does not apply to the civil realm, I think you're going to have a very hard time combating Marxism, and you're going to plant the seeds for it. You're going to say, well, we don't touch that out there. We can't define justice biblically. So if the Marxists say civil justice is this redistribution of wealth, we're just going to preach the gospel in the church. Well, then you're going to have this where these people are going to be like, eventually they're going to be like, well, this is true justice, and we're taking over your church. Agree? Disagree? Thoughts on that?
No, we have taken on ourselves here, appointed ourselves a church committee, to define justice apart from the Bible, which is absolutely what's happened. And socialism is based on covetousness. And you have to give up the 10th commandment in order to be a socialist, because nobody's a socialist when it's coming out of their pocket. Mm-hmm. They're all socialists when they say it's coming my way. And you can't have socialism without already desiring your neighbor's stuff. I get a kick out of this one. Oh, we hate slavery. All right. Well, socialism is based on the idea that my neighbor owes me the results of his labor. That is socialism. My neighbor owes me.
How is that different than slavery?
How is that different? My neighbor has more than me. He might have worked harder than me while I was sitting around watching football, and he might have been out at night, but he still owes me. My neighbor owes me. And that is what it is based on. And it's not that hard to read the Bible. The 10 minas, right? And those who stood by, take the mina from him and give it to him who has 10. You remember the parable. Mm-hmm. But they said to him, Master, he has 10 minas. Equalize the wealth around here. No. Christ says, I'm going to give it to the guy who has 10. You know why? Because I can do that, because I'm Christ. And Christ can set up some people with more ability to make money, and he can establish other people who have other abilities. My neighbor does not owe me any of his money, no matter how much money he happens to have. I still remember back the Rodney King riots, speaking of old people here, I remember that. And there was a case where they were interviewing people who were taking stuff out of a store, right? And they were just carrying it off. And back then, the reporter said to one girl who was carrying off like a TV or something, says, well, don't you know that this is wrong, right? And you know what this girl said? She had more sense than the reporter. She said, why not? It's all free anyway. What she's saying is, what's the difference between waiting for the money that's taken from someone else anyway in a welfare check and just going directly? I think you're better off. Just go directly and carry it off. Let's cut out the middleman.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, any thoughts on that, Travis? Because my point here is that in order for, and this might not be a foolproof argument, but in order for whether it's the United Methodist Church or another church, or even we could say down to a local church, if you're not going to apply the Bible, like if you want to combat this ideology of Andy Oliver, and I'm sure there are many pastors like him, you have to say, hey, your understanding of justice in society is wrong based on the Bible. And I think a lot of churches haven't touched that. And I think we talked about before how you would even say the dispensationalists laid the groundwork for the social justice movement, because they said, hey, don't teach the Bible in the civil sphere. Let the pagans do it. And they gave us Marxism. So
the Bible only tells us how to get to heaven.
Right.
It has nothing to say about civil society. Despite so in that vacuum, the Marxists have walked right into that vacuum. They said, okay, well, you Christians won't teach about the civil sphere. We'll take over from here.
Yeah.
They have.
Yeah, and I just find it interesting that, and I'm sure there's other issues as well, the progressives, I would imagine, will deny, the resurrection, and they'll probably say, but the way it's presented here is a social justice, civil thing, and that's just interesting to me. It's not, maybe in the past you had some, and they're all unorthodox views, but the more focus on, you fundamentalists, what you believe, but now we see maybe their end game, we want to restructure society. Travis, any final thoughts on this whole discussion?
Yeah, I think we can't get away from being biblicists, is what this really comes down to. I know there's a lot of discussion within confessional Christianity right now about the role of biblicism. And when I say that, I guess I'm referring to someone whose ultimate standard and authority is the Bible. And this is something that James White talks a lot about, and others.
Key statement there, the Bible versus the New Testament. That's a subtle distinction people make all the time. Well, I'm a New Testament Christian.
Well, there's no such thing.
There's no such thing.
Right.
Yeah. It's all or nothing.
Yep.
Really.
Package deal.
Yeah. Now, there's a lot of interpretive things that go into that. And even at the table here, we would probably all have different nuances that we would, in how we would apply that. But
Presbyterian, a Methodist, and 2 Baptists. It's great. Diversity and inclusion.
This is DEI right here. Yeah.
Diversity, inclusion, and equity.
See, we
right
do
here
that. We do that. Yeah. So there's 2. You guys practice infant baptism, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's 2 Credo Baptists, 2 Pedo Baptists at the table. I think that's the first that's happened since I've been on the Patriot.
Have you been outnumbered that long, huh?
I'm always outnumbered with these guys. Yeah. But it's good company.
Yeah.
But the point, I guess, is that, we have to get to the place where the Bible's the standard. There's always going to be a standard. And if it's not scripture, then you're elevating something to the status of above scripture. It's like Francis Schaeffer said, if there's no God above the system, in which he was talking about the state at that point, but I would even say in your denomination or anywhere, if there's no God above that system, then the system itself is God.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know you disagree on me with this. I would say that's another argument against the huge denominations because, and I have a final question for you, and I don't know if it's a fair question at the end, and then I'll let you make whatever comment you want. Joshua Wellman said, could Luther, with all the power of the Reformation, reform the Catholic Church? Could the Puritans reform the English Church? And he talked about how you had the 39 articles that were Reformed, Calvinistic, and out the window. So my final question, answer this as little as you want. I know there's a lot of factors that go into this. I'm curious on your personal thoughts, and we might have some different views, but and you could maybe make it broader and not about Hopeland, but just in general. And this goes to your point, Travis, that if we're trying to constantly get back to the Bible, how do you do that in a denomination that if you come to realize, well, I think we need there's a serious change that needs to happen in our theology. Whether it is getting away from Arminianism, or maybe it's not. Maybe someone says, no, I believe that's true, but there's something else in the denomination. And how do you reform? And this is my challenge if you're in the denomination, and this is Joshua Wellman's point, like, how do you reform a denomination? There's so much opposition. He says that the greatest thing about the denomination is maintaining its peace. And maybe we quibble with that. Well, in this case, the UMC, they split, but he does say splits happen. So that's a lot there, but I know we haven't talked a ton about this, so I'm not sure your total personal views on everything. You're definitely not the typical Methodist, though. That's for sure. You're not the typical Methodist. And so
doesn't fit the mold.
And so I understand that there's a lot that goes into, okay, there's probably things you're teaching on slowly and bringing the congregation. I get all that. But I'm just taking a step back and saying, big picture, big denomination, whether it's UMC or another one, how do you reform those on matters that really would undercut the fabric of their statement? We see it happening the other way all the time. The progressives come in, 39 articles, we don't care, gone. UMC, traditional marriage, done. So I don't know, that's a loaded question. There's a lot to it, but just respond any way you'd like. To Travis's point and my point, how can you, and it's not just like to put you, because same thing with Travis, this. Like how would the PCA change if it came to say, what the Bible says, we believe the Bible doesn't teach X about baptism. I mean, that would, I don't think that would ever happen. I mean, maybe it could, but you know what I'm saying? There's challenges there. So anyway.
This is where I think I'll show my cards as a more radical Methodist.
All right, let's hear it.
I think one of the biggest ways that you can do that is to get away from topical preaching in general. Okay. I think that you need to let the biblical authors speak in the way and the form that they actually authored it in. They wrote it in order for a reason, not just for the time, but for the people to read. And part of the way that we get to all these different splintering topics is that we aren't reading it in bulk in the way that the authors actually intended for this information to come out. We pick little pieces here and we say it says this and this and this. Well, rather than saying, you know what, let's look at the entire narrative whole and the cohesive whole from the beginning. Because, I mean, there's a lot of study that goes into, and I'm sure you guys know this as well. You read the beginning of Matthew, and the Matthew is going to parallel towards the end. Matthew put structures within that structure that point to greater theological points. Without getting into like the technical language that we all talk about that whenever we're in ministry. That is one of the biggest things that I think that we could do is to move towards a more expository style of preaching, letting the authors speak for themselves. And I think some of the founders of the denominations that we're talking about here, whether we're talking about John Calvin, whether we're talking about Martin Luther, I think it's also important to see that they may have seen, maybe they didn't know any other different system, but they also didn't try to move away from the society entirely and become completely independent. They did create Geneva. They did have Luther, like Protestant Germany, they had larger societies and they did try to formulate larger communal groups. So they did see some value in there, right or wrong.
Yeah, no.
Our examples are groups, our entire groups. Yes. Knox would be another one. That's going to, yep.
So a question for you, Paul, if you found, whether it was with the UMC or another denomination or whatever you're in, if you believe the Bible taught something that went contrary to the denominational statement of faith or whatever you call it, would you still teach what the Bible says?
Yes.
Okay.
Emphatically.
All right. And that's kind of what you're getting at. Yeah. And I think we might say, oh, that's an easy yes answer, but I think once it's applied and worked out, it becomes challenging. And and right or wrong, as far as the denomination, it does become challenging. And it's something to consider. So,
well, that's where the role of a faithful elders, pastors, whatever you want to call it, living, before God in their conscience, doing and preaching and teaching whatever it is that they are convinced of from Scripture. That's the most important thing.
yeah, amen.
So if you're in a denomination, if you're in a local church that doesn't affiliate with anyone else, if you're in an association, all of these can become corrupt and do become corrupt eventually. There's no example of any congregation anywhere in the world that is still hundreds of years in the making, still faithful, that I can think
That's
of.
true. No, it was a good point earlier too. Yeah.
Okay, well, lots of good stuff there, and we could continue this discussion. Maybe we'd love to have you back, Paul. Anything else you need to add, Joel?
No, I was going to talk about socialism, but maybe another day. Leviticus 19. I'll do it anyway.
Yeah.
Leviticus 19. You shall do. Leviticus aims. This is the book that could drop right out of the Bible. None of us would miss it, right? Leviticus. Who even knows what's in there? Well, not quite. Leviticus 19:50. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. There goes liberation theology. There goes social justice. There goes all the equalizing of income right by the boards. It's going to be based on the law word of God. And if the poor guy steals from the rich guy, he's just as guilty as the rich guy stealing from the poor guy, as Nathan the prophet said to David. So that's going. Leviticus 19:16, you shall not go about as a talebearer among your people. You shall not take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. There goes abortion. Right here in Leviticus. Next verse, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. There goes political correctness nonsense. Let's all feel good. Let's okay, yeah, we're gonna have an argument, but the key is we all feel good about it when we're done, and we're not gonna really say, we're not gonna rebuke anybody, because they don't do that anymore. And then, like Leviticus 19:8, next verse, you shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now we all agree with that. Yeah, well, that's the past few verses exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But I'm a New Testament Christian.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
All right, last word for you, Paul. We got to wrap up. Anything you want to say in general to people listening that may be part of the United Methodist Church? I know Travis knows some people that are in there. I mean, obviously you speak to your congregation regularly, so it's not like you have to address them. But anything you want to say to people that are in this, or any message you have here at the end?
Two things. One is just a general thing. If I can encourage everybody, just read your scriptures. There's so much that is said about polity. I can get into the legalese of things, but if I wasn't grounded in the scriptures, if I wasn't dependent on a Savior who gave his life, not just for me, but for the sins of me, who gave it up and took that sin on himself, then I would be in trouble. And that is not preached often enough. For those that are outside of the United Methodist Church, I would say, please pray for your brethren that are inside. There are good people that are here that are trying to hold to a very biblical, you might not agree with them on everything, but you're going to have far more allies than you might even imagine. And so pray for those people that are still kind of caught up in the weeds in this, and pray for our overseas ministries too, because that's probably coming next year.
Okay. Well, I look forward to hearing more about that. And you, Methodist pastor, we got you in here. I'm still trying to get the Reformed Presbyterian pastors in, so so you talk about allies there. So I appreciate you coming in and be willing to discuss this stuff. So where can people find information about Hopeland Church? Is it Hopeland?
HopelandUMC.org.
HopelandUMC.org. And are your sermons on there?
Yeah, there's sermons that go up there. I believe we're also on Apple Podcasts. We're on Facebook. We're on a number of different social media platforms.
Okay, so check out Paul Miller. Joel and Travis, thanks for joining me once again. Hopefully this was helpful. And
thank you.
Hopefully we can have you in again sometime, Paul. For more information about the Lancaster Patriot, go to lancasterpatriot.com. Until next time, remember that Christ, not man, is king. So long.